According to reports last week from the Press and Sun Bulletin, the invasive plant giant hogweed has been identified at 79 locations in the southern tier so far this year. And that might not seem like that big a deal, except for the fact that the plant is dangerous to humans and the rest of the environment. Well, how can you identify the plant? And what can you do once you have? Well, here to talk about these questions is Pat Curran, the Horticulture Program Manager for the Cornell Cooperative Extension of Tompkins County. Pat, thanks for taking the time to talk with me.
Oh, you're welcome.
So, as I mentioned, there has been a little bit of news coverage about the spread of giant hogweed in the county. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that plant.
Well, it's pretty recognizable at this time of the year. It's 8 to 12 feet tall, enormous leaves, over a foot across, and the flower head can be 18 inches across. It looks like a giant Queen Anne's lace because it's in the same family as Queen Anne's lace and carrots. And it reacts with your skin the situation is called phytophotodermatitis. That is, if you get the juice on your skin and there's sunlight and moisture, you'll get a very bad burn that will probably send you to the emergency room, depending on where on your body it's located.
And how did giant hogweed come to New York State in the first place? Is this a native plant?
Well, no, it's not native. It was, unfortunately, one of those things that gardeners imported because it was such a striking ornamental. And it is ornamental, but you don't want to get anywhere near it, and you don't want to allow it to spread because it's a real hazardous plant.
Now, is the threat of this plant, is it just human contact? Are there any other kind of impacts giant hogweed has in the environment?
Well, apparently it likes moist spots, so it could be a serious problem to the environment by replacing native plants. Of course, native plants are what our native wildlife feed on, so it could have bad environmental effects as well, yes.
You know, we've heard about hogweed maybe in the news because, it sounds scary. You think about the burns. So it's a very large plant. But what are some of the other invasive plant species that the Cornell Cooperative Extension works to educate people about?
Well, I'm glad you asked that because the blooming period for Japanese knotweed will be starting in the next week or two. Japanese knotweed is not hazardous to touch, but it's a real environmental hazard. It grows up to 6 to 8 feet tall. It has a stem that resembles bamboo, so sometimes people call it bamboo, but of course it's not a bamboo. It looks like a shrub by this time of year because it's so big, but it's actually herbaceous perennial, which means it dies down to the ground in the winter and then overwinters as the roots and then springs into life in the spring and grows very rapidly. So in about a week or two, there'll be frothy white flower plumes on all the Japanese knotweed that isn't being controlled by being cut back. And the environmental hazard is that this is also like moist spots, and it's filling up riverbanks and replacing native plants. And you also see it along roadsides a lot, and it's extremely hard to get rid of. It's a very vigorous plant, and there's really almost no way to control it other than a herbicide.
So is knotweed native to New York as well, or is this something that was brought in?
No, that's a native of Asia. As a matter of fact, we reserve the term invasive plant for plants that are not native here, that have come from other places, and they came here. Sometimes, unfortunately, they came as ornamentals or as herbs, and they don't bring their native diseases and insects that control them in their place of origin with them. So they go hog wild here, and they often outcompete native plants. Another example is honeysuckle. Honeysuckle is very much an understory plant in woods. There's a problem there. It leaves out early in the spring before our native plants do, and it stays green late into the fall, past the time that our native plants lose their leaves and go dormant, and it produces red or orange or yellow fruits, which the birds love. Unfortunately, they spread it all over, and then it turns the understory into thickets of bushes that outcompete native things like trilliums.
That's interesting to hear about honeysuckle. I'm from Georgia originally, so I'm very familiar with honeysuckle patches and never knew that that was not native.
Yeah, well, there are native honeysuckle vines, but the shrubs are not native. And as a matter of fact, at the Cornell Wildflower Garden, they used to, and they probably still have, a place where they are controlling the honeysuckle and seeing how many native plants come back, which was encouraging to see that some native plants did come back. But there's a big contrast. But on one side of the path, the honeysuckle had been removed, and on the other side of the path, the honeysuckle was still there. And what a striking difference. Unfortunately, there's a number of invasive shrubs that are not native that are spread by birds because they are berry producing. Another one is barberry, which is still being sold by many nurseries for landscape use, but it's also invading the woods. It's also quite shade tolerant.
Was it just the case that maybe when these plants were originally brought over to the States, if they were brought over as ornamentals, were people at that time just maybe not aware of the impact that these plant species would have?
Oh, I think that's fair to say. They never dreamt that these would become so overly, competitive that they would try to take over the landscape. And then there's an interesting case of garlic mustard, which was apparently brought over as an herb, 100 or 200 years ago. And for years it was probably there, but it wasn't a problem. And then in the late 90s, all of a sudden the garlic mustard had some kind of mutation or something happened, and all of a sudden it became a major problem. It's also shade tolerant and will outcompete things like trilliums and jack in the pulpit and things like that are a normal constituent of our shady wildflower flora.
And if we think about the state of things as they are now, right, we're living in an area where these invasive species are already present. We are not the ones who necessarily brought them over here. What really can people do to help stem the spread of these invasive species?
Well, I encourage people not to buy barberry, not to buy burning bush, not to buy, shrubby honeysuckles, and a couple other things that spread by berries or fruits, like Oriental bittersweet is a vine which climbs up trees and kills them by shading them out, and that is also a problem because of the fruit. Depending on where you are, if you're in the middle of the city and you have a couple of barberry plants, well, it's probably not realistic to expect you to rip them out. But I think that people who live out in the country should not plant things like burning bush and barberry and Oriental bittersweet, because the chance for those things to escape into the rural landscape is too great. Another one that people might not think of is Norway maple. Norway maple has invaded our gorges where it outcompetes the native sugar maple. Now, as a city tree, it's okay. They're not planting them anymore because they want to diversify the street tree flora in the city. But out in the country, I don't think you should plant a Norway maple. I think you can find a decent native tree that will serve the purpose better.
Mm-hmm. And this question is maybe playing a little bit of devil's advocate, but if you think about the fact that these plants were brought over by humans, and we are very much a part of this environment, could we not just look at the growth of these species that may not necessarily be native to, say, central New York, because they were brought over by humans? Is this maybe just not the natural progression of things to have these new species come in, compete with native species, and potentially outperform them in the wild?
Well, the problem is that there are really negative effects with this for all our wildlife. For instance, garlic mustard is related to native mustards. There's a butterfly that lays eggs on garlic mustard, and then the caterpillars cannot mature because the caterpillars will not eat the garlic mustard. But the female butterfly doesn't know the difference, but the caterpillars do. And then there's another invasive that's becoming more and more of a problem that I haven't mentioned yet, which is swallowwort. Swallowwort is in the milkweed family. It's also very shade tolerant, unfortunately. It's a vine that dies back to the ground in the winter, and then it climbs up things and strangles them and produces seed pods that resemble milkweed so that the white feathery seeds blow all over. And monarch butterflies will lay eggs on swallowwort, but the caterpillars will not eat it. So that's a problem. And then the shrubs that are on the forest floor replacing native things are a problem for birds. And there's also an association of some of these invasive shrubs are not eaten by deer. So that's another problem for the native plants. I mean, not only do they have the deer preferring to eat them, but now they also have their ecological niches being taken over by these invasive shrubs. So I do everything I can on my property to remove the invasives.
And Pat, if people want more information about some of these invasive species and maybe some of the work that the Cornell Cooperative Extension is doing to combat them, where can they find that information?
Well, I have fact sheets here on about 10 or 12 of the worst invasives. Plus, we have a weed wrench here, which you might want to Google. It's a large orange thing about 6 feet tall, which is really useful for removing honeysuckle shrubs. It kind of jacks them out of the ground, root and all. And we let people borrow that with no fee. We just ask for a deposit check until they bring it back. So it's currently out of the office for a week and a half, but some members of the public call us up and reserve that, and then they use it to remove honeysuckles and burning bush and a multiflora rose, which I didn't mention, a few of the other shrubby invasives. So that's another way we can help.
Well, a number of resources down at the Cornell Cooperative Extension. And I have been speaking with Pat Curran. She's the Horticulture Program Manager for the Cornell Cooperative Extension of Tompkins County about some of the invasive plants we have here in our area. Pat, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
Oh, you're welcome.